Well, I find it interesting, genuinely interesting, although it is just, early of the second day. But the entire conference is 3 days only, so we are approaching the mid-time. I think that it is really necessary to have regular occasions for people to come together and co-create something in terms of alternatives to mainstream mental health service systems, which, backed by the law, are too often oppressive and violate basic human rights, especially, right to liberty, right to be free from torture and other forms of ill treatment, and also legal capacity. Because if you go home and you work in your local environments, we very often feel lonely. We feel as if we were from another planet, People do not understand ourselves very well. And it takes significant effort not only to explain why are we holding the beliefs what we are holding, but it takes also significant effort from those who were socialized in the old approach to mental health to open their minds and listen to us. Now, if either of the parties is not ready and prepared for such a discourse, then we are in a trouble. But we ourselves, who are on the new paradigm side, need some regular occasions to recharge ourselves. Yeah, so just about my identification, I am a survivor of psychiatry who was also a son of a mother who unfortunately did not survive psychiatry. And I started working as a volunteer activist on something which now we could call self-help and mutual support of people who had been in the system and didn't find it very helpful, or at least spent some time in the system which did not really meet their needs. And then I had the privilege to meet some disability groups and organizations of persons with disabilities. And I started to develop this very deep belief that mental health issues are not medical conditions. Rather, they are quite similar to what disability was understood by my disability activist friends. Namely, it is not an impairment, which in our case, it is not evident if there is a real impairment behind our issues at all, but it is rather the barriers to full and effective participation in society which prevents us from being full citizens in our societies, full members of our local communities, and running a happy and satisfactory life defined on our own terms. So I joined in various cross-disability activism, first in my own country, Hungary, and then on the European level, and then in the international level. Exactly. I think that the most authentic I can be about my own experience, which very much contributed me, taking on this new venture about mutual support and self-help in my own country. I had been in psychiatry already when my mother died. And she died under very suspicious circumstances, which can be best explained supposing that she was a subject in a clinical drug trial without knowing about it. And she was given a traditional, an old-fashioned medication. She was in the control group. And she had a heart condition for which this old medication was strongly contraindicated. And she died of sudden cardiac failure. And I went mad. I went really mad after that. And I went so mad that I could not even leave my home. Whenever I tried to approach the door, the level of anxiety and the voices and everything around it were so intense and so frightening that I physically could not approach the door. I can't even recall how much time I spent in that condition, then unexpectedly a friend and former student of mine showed up. He was still a university student and it was summertime. It was vacation for him and he had no better thing to do than moving to my place and staying with me for 2 months. And I really acknowledge my survival at the very primary level to him and to his support, because I had no food at home. So he did the shopping for me and I didn't feel like eating. So in a friendly manner, he convinced me that at least some food and fluids are not bad. And he tried to talk to me, but apparently I was not ready for any verbal communication. I could not simply understand what he was telling me. And he didn't force this. Just being with me, not trying to tell me anything which I was not ready to receive, but being with me, keeping some sort of a daily routine, letting me being in a safe space in my own apartment, helped me that by the time I realized that I had been running out of my medication, which I was on at that time, and discovering that actually, in spite of having had no medication, my condition improved day by day. And after 2 months, I had this experience of eureka that, my gosh, this is the first time in my life that I was in a very deep psychotic crisis situation and I did not take any medication. And after 2 months, I was out of it. And for the first time in my life, I was out of it while stronger than before the crisis. Because my earlier crisis experiences were, that I entered the crisis and then either voluntarily or involuntarily I was admitted to a psychiatric unit and I was given the medication, again either voluntarily or involuntarily. And I, for a long time, believed that I had some biochemical imbalance in my brain. So the medications are the only thing which can be helpful. And I understood that the medications were far from ideal. But I did hope that with the coming of newer and newer medications, that will be the solution to my problems. Now this time, I had to revisit all my beliefs. And that really pushed me towards an open-minded reflection about, first of all, what happened to my mother in the mental health system, how did she die, and if such things can happen, whether psychiatry can be seen as a helping profession or something entirely different. And I started to absorb knowledge, which I hadn't had before. I started reading Foucault, Thomas Sass, and many others, Lang. And I tried to find other people around myself who held similar thoughts, or at least struggled with similar questions. And it was a very empowering experience to discover that I was not the only one. And that was the start of my activism in this field. And then I understood that I was extremely lucky in the sense that I had a friend who was just free at the time of my crisis. And he decided to give me 2 months of his life. You cannot expect even the closest friend to do that. But at the very same time, understanding that sometimes what you need is just the presence, the real presence of someone you trust, who is close enough to you. And then the crisis itself will resolve itself. And this should be available for all people who experience this crisis. And that was one of the strong motivations that I, with several friends, established the very first user survivor only organization in Hungary and tried to play with how can we replicate what happened to me in an environment where you do not rely on a very close friend and very lucky constellation. So sharing the supportive role among several people who all had similar experience to the person who is right now in the crisis, and arrange the support based on trust, based on mutual relationship accordingly. And until now, I think one of the real confirmations or reaffirmations of my belief that what happened to me through a friend can happen to many other people in support networks was a young woman who developed a very acute crisis. And of course, mental health system's response would have been an immediate involuntary hospitalization and treatment. Now we made her father our ally, and together he and us convinced the young woman's psychiatrist to give us a try. And we arranged a very intensive support around the young woman with the involvement of the father, but based on the wills and preferences of the young woman. And I have to tell you that for 3 weeks it was like a hell. I mean, nobody in this network had a peaceful hour because something happened all the time. But after a while, you know, we got accommodated to it, and we understood that psychosis on a superficial level may look very frightening. But actually it is far less frightening as outsiders believe, and biomedical psychiatry tells you how dangerous it is. And the majority of us also held, you know, that whenever you enter a psychotic crisis, it has a purpose. Something is ready in you as a person to go through enormous challenges which you might be unable to do on your own without support, but in a safe space with supportive people who are present around you. What happened is that when this very intense anxiety and permanent anxiety started to dissolve, both in the young woman who was in the crisis and in us who were part of her support network, it started to be a very rewarding experience. And it was a journey where evidently, you know, the person in a crisis made her own journey, but each one of us who had anything to do in her support network, we shared something of that journey. And it was very interesting, very difficult at the same time, really, really rewarding experience. And we ourselves got out from that experience of hers as much stronger people. And each of us were more trustful after this shared experience that whatever happens to us as individuals, we can rely on these people and on this network. And they will be with us individually as we were together with this young woman in the crisis. And as a side effect, her psychiatrist, who in the beginning was quite reluctant, but had the open mind to say, okay, I give you a chance. If it doesn't work, then we will hospitalize the woman, but we give you a chance. He was quite closely watching, you know, what's going on in this network. And by the end of the period of 3-4 weeks, he had to acknowledge that he had never seen such a thing before. And later on, he recommended several of his clients to contact us when they were approaching a crisis situation, which again was good, because just talking to someone whose professional life had been dependent on the old paradigm is not enough to convince them that there is a world outside biomedical psychiatry. And I think that this is important if a professional has an open mind, doesn't want to control you, but has the open mind enough to start in a way, you know, working with you, where actually you are working and they step back and keep their mind open to revisit their beliefs. is the only way to create sustainable alliances with those who are in the profession.